Shout on, pray on, we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Biblical Home believes every home should be filled with faith, warmth, and purpose. That's why they've created a collection of wholesome products designed to help families grow closer to each other and God. Candles, laundry detergent, bracelets, journals are just some of the products sold at Biblical Home. Join their mission to fill homes with scripture and love. Explore our faith-filled collection at abiblicalhome.org. Use the discount code Eschatology Matters to get 20% off your entire purchase.
Do you want to start reading the Puritans but don't know where to begin? Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. Learn more about the Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. Enter promo code EMATTERS for 10% off your whole order. Welcome to another episode of Is Christian Nationalism Dead? This is our new series at Eschatology Matters, where we discuss theology, politics, and how we as churchmen should think about it all. My guest for today's episode is Eric Conn. He is a pastor at Refuge Church in Ogden, Utah, and podcast host of the King's Hall and Hard Men podcast. Eric, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we're going to dive straight into it. The question for this series is Christian nationalism dead? This was something that people were tweeting all about in the fall. I wonder if it's changed since the presidency and things of that nature, but that was a big conversation. This whole Christian nationalism, it was a big, splash, a big, kind of like a shooting star where it had a lot of light, a lot of heat, but then faded out. Do you think that's true? Do you think Christian nationalism is dead?
Yeah, it is a good question, I think, to be asking, particularly, I think, because there was so much conflict and tension, probably largely within the camp through the fall and in Christmas. And I think what you're seeing is a lot of people, actually, I would argue, because it's coming to the forefront and people are realizing, hey, some of these ideas are being mainstreamed and we should probably figure out what they mean. So you have a lot of camps, I think, right now who would maybe identify with the label or not. But some of the theonomists, you've got some of the classical reform guys, the magisterial reformer types, who are sort of going back and forth about what does this term mean. But I would actually argue that the reason we're talking about it, the reason it's so central in this attention economy, especially on social media, I've seen it mostly on X in particular, but the reason that it's been such a prominent conversation is because I think people realize it's important. I think what we've watched by and large, is the left has dominated the political space for a long time. And you have some neoconservatives, which I would fundamentally characterize as still being part of like the centrist, old liberal order. They've kind of had power, but, a lot of people have pointed this out. It's sort of been a one-party state, if you will. And so now that things are changing, I think particularly with Trump, we're saying, what would it actually look like if power was wielded in a way that was at least more conducive to Christianity? And so I think because of that, people are having to ask a lot of really tough questions that, quite frankly, that I didn't grow up having to answer. I think because of the version of Christianity that we had mostly in the 20th century and early 21st century was so focused, I think, on personal piety. Of course, those are all good things. But we were spending less time, I think, then talking about, what should the civil magistrate be doing? What's his job? Is it to in a John Calvin sense, is it to bring about appointing other people to an eternal and heavenly good? What role should religion and politics play? You hear a lot of things like, no, there's a separation of church and state. What does that terminology even mean? So I think because of that, because of the rise and the prominence, you've seen a lot more discussion about the topic.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of framing why there seems to be even some pushback in it, is not because it's dying, but because it's becoming more alive. I think that's a really, and you see this happen in all types of areas, where once something becomes real and has to actually be implemented, that's where friction starts happening. Because maybe all Christians would say, do I want Christianity more popular in America? Yes. Do I want the state to say, God is true and I should create laws that account for that. Of course, it's really hard for even the most like Anabaptist type Christians to not see the benefit of saying, hey, it's good to have like to obey God, right? But the question is, okay, what does that actually look like? Should the government be
Yes.
making those kind of Christian rules? So when you think through Christian nationalism, you mentioned a couple different kind of versions of it. You got Calvin, kind of the traditional reform kind of position. I know Stephen Wolfe in his book kind of leans very much on the reformed tradition in that way. You got different kind of takes on it from various different people, some friends, some enemies who are trying to define this term. When you think about this term, because I think that might be helpful to kind of go into what flavor of Christian nationalism are you thinking about? And yeah, maybe that could help get a little bit of definitions for us.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will say as we jump into this has been one of the things that I've wanted to see more of is that it's a temptation, I think, for any of us. I came from more of the theonomic background, slowly kind of maybe a hybrid towards Stephen Wolfe, read his book and thought, oh, yeah, these are some really interesting things to think through. So somewhere kind of in that spectrum is where I would put myself. But one of the good starting points I think that would be really helpful is saying, as Christians, fundamentally, in Christian nationalism, we want our country to be ordered around Christian principles and Christian doctrine. And if we could kind of start from a framework of that and then say, okay, if I'm on the classical two kingdoms side, let's have some debates between the theonomists and the classical position. And because I think what's actually going on a lot in the discussion is you have people talking past each other because we don't even understand the definitions. And I'll be honest, from a theonomic perspective, when I first read Dr. Wolfe's book, I thought, wow, this is kind of a very different way of looking at some of these issues than I would have necessarily been comfortable with originally. But as I've heard him debate other people and have discussions, that's been actually really helpful. So I think fundamentally on theonomy, on that side, you kind of have a Van Tillian strand in Rushdoony theology developed more in the 1980s, let's say. Reconstruction comes about. And generally what that's produced is guys who are probably be more politically on the libertarian right, and which is fine. That's kind of where a lot of them end up, not all of them. And then I think with the classical two kingdoms position, you had a very different political environment at the time. Monarchies were still a thing. So even as you sift through those principles, that's one thing that I've looked at and said, likelihood that America becomes a monarchy tomorrow, probably not very high. So however we make application for the classical two kingdoms position, we certainly want to be cognizant of that and some of the alterations that would have to be made. And then I think the bigger portion here is actually juxtaposing either one of those two views against the post-war consensus. You've heard this terminology, or just the liberal secular order. And so I think that is also a friction point. What I would say with guys as we debate these issues is being charitable and saying, actually the theonomists are my brothers and so are the classical two kingdom guys. Some of this stuff may be foreign, but we certainly want to work through it. I think in the framing of Stephen's position in particular, it would be something like the Christian nation acting for the Christian good of that nation. And I think in particular, Stephen ends up talking about a lot of things like, would you legislate Christian morality? But even if you go back to the founders, I think the theonomists would probably even agree with this, that all legislation is morality.
Yep.
So the question is, not whether, but which morality is going to be legislated. And so I think from some of those foundational starting points, we could say, okay, I think we can all agree, like the foundation pieces, like we want abortion to go away legally. That should be an illegal act. We shouldn't be codifying homosexual marriage or gay marriage. So starting with some of those, I think would be helpful because I think what we'd find is we probably agree on most of that. Some of the more complex issues just are going to require a lot of debate.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like the interesting point about all of this debate is if you ask what are the closest things to actually being accomplished, it's like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? I remember when that happened being a big deal. Yeah. I think right now, Idaho, I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, like there's a pushback over the overturn of Obergefell, which would be huge. Like these are things, at least in this small kind of reform, like niche Twitter, debates, like we all would be on the same page of like overturning those things. It's when you get into like Sabbath laws or you get into blasphemy laws where I think that's where like, hey, what do you really mean about this sort of thing? And I think those debates are good because we should probably figure out them before we even have to make those decisions. But it seems like, we end up shooting ourselves in the foot as kind of like a group, because there are actual enemies to this view, right? There are people who, not even just like the theonomists, like I think if you stay within the Christian realm, there's even people who, whether it's from like a dispensational kind of side of it, where you kind of create a separation from physical, political promises, those go to Israel. So any physical political theory of Christianity is already like, what is that the term, like, over realizing, eschatology, or
Yeah.
you go to the kind of, what is it, like Escondido, PCA, kind of the reform circle over there, who's like radical two kingdom, where they say they're totally separate. And so there's different rules almost over there. Why do you think you get pushback almost from like opposite sides, from like the truly reformed guys over here and also like the dispensational over here? And then obviously you have the attacks from, the liberals and even the guys like, James Lindsay, an atheist. Why do you think there's attacks almost coming from all these different sides? And, as Christians who agree, like theonomists, is there wisdom of us trying to kind of coalescing and saying, okay, let's have our intervarsity quibbles, which is helpful and good, but we need to keep moving and growing upon this momentum?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. And I think part of this is, there's a range here, obviously, but my argument for like R2K, Radical Two Kingdoms, sort of following the same trajectory of like the pietist movement within Christianity, the focus on the inward to the exclusion of the externals, involvement in the world, that sort of thing, separating of the kingdoms completely. I think part of those, I would argue those theologies sort of arose in and around the post-liberal order so that they could kind of sort of coexist next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these theologies are just recognizing, okay, we have this huge state. Maybe we just tell Christians that, it's really about your prayer closet and you and Jesus. And so we're kind of tailoring the theology to match the cultural context. Of course, then you would get the theonomists who would be like, no, we agree with you. Like this, this God state, the total state is a really bad thing. So maybe they're pushing back for different reasons. But I think what's unique about kind of the more of the Stephen Wolfian version of Christian nationalism is it may be the thing that is most foreign to the conscientiousness and the conversation in the evangelical church in the last 100 years. So I would equate it to something like when we talk about biblical sext piety and patriarchy and hierarchy as opposed to egalitarianism. Well, I mean, there's certain ideologies that are more compatible with egalitarian thought that have invaded the church. And so those naturally will receive less pushback. I think when you want to go back to theology that was pre-1900, let's say, the further back you get, I think the more pushback you're likely to have. And I would even say in, Westminsterian denominations like the, PCA, OPC, even there, the conversations are just hard. They're going to take a lot of time because, like Stephen Wolfe would say something. And then I go, well, wait a minute, I'm going to have to go back to the institutes and read what Calvin said about the magistrate. Because there were quite frankly things that Stephen had said. And I was like, wow, that seems pretty far fetched. That's, even comments like Calvin will say things like the highest class of ruler on earth is the king. And I'm thinking, well, I'm been in this like ecclesiocentric sort of theonomic world. And I'm thinking, well, isn't it the pastor? And so to read that from Calvin, whether you agree or not, it's just definitely worth going back and saying, why did they think that? Why did they reason that way? And quite frankly, those conversations take a lot of time. Part of the, I guess the infighting too, that is, it's probably sped along by the medium itself of X, because you have like 120, 140 characters, whatever it is, to make your point. And so making really long theological arguments is often not what wins on Twitter. And so people might read the first tweet, they haven't read the other ones. And so really what I've encouraged guys on all sides, we've had some really good conversations with guys from both camps, and I appreciate you guys doing this as well. But we've said as a media company, hey, let's have some of these debates, because even as I've worked through it, I'm not 100% clear on all the differences between like theonomy and classical two kingdoms. So let's have those discussions with the experts who know each position well. Let's do it as brothers. And then hopefully the church itself will be strengthened through that discussion, which I think is just going to take time. If you figure that whatever the church is today is a result of at least 100 years of catechesis, then like making a pivot is going to be a slow process.
Yeah, no, I think that's wise. I've enjoyed some conversations, even one I just listened to yesterday. So I'm a little behind. But Dave Green, Neil Shenvi. I don't know if you listened to that one.
I did.
That was just really helpful to kind of think about like, what does it look like to take a position, right? And say something like, oh, there is a priority of family, and then extend the logic, right?
Yes.
And it's funny because you hear both of them say, yeah, there's concentric circles. And then it seems like there's some line that Neil drew where that concentric circle like doesn't allow him to go further than that, or it jumps to the nation, but the ethnos in between the nation and the family, he says that's not allowed, but maybe. And so these kind of conversations were really helpful, I think, to kind of think through different ideas. And one thing that Dave Green mentioned that really blew me away was, you guys talk a lot at Ogden about, the post-war consensus, post-liberal order. I tend, and I think people who watch Eschatology Matters know that I tend to like really agree and see a lot of that. I was raised in public schools, I think it's natural for a person raised in that kind of context. I'm in Orange County, California, it's conservative, so to speak, in California, but it's California conservative, right? And so, I was raised kind of with a lot of liberal kind of thinking, right? Evolution, egalitarianism, America is kind of an evil people that kind of did a lot of evil stuff. The only good stuff we did was stuff that supported the modern view of humanity, right? Civil rights acts, homosexuality, like that sort of thing. And so as we go through all these narratives, the elites kind of really control this. He was making an argument. And that's why it's interesting with Christian nationalism. It's felt like, at least in my generation, just Christianity was weakening its influence in politics. And that's why I think you're saying that there's a reason why this kind of like piety focus makes sense, because that's the area we still have control. There's still power. There's still something we could actively do. But politics feels like a long shot. So maybe it's just wiser to focus on inward piety. But what Dave Green kind of mentioned is to see a change happen, how do you go from the elites having control of propaganda to a shift like this? And to me, and I want to kind of get your thoughts on this, there's been two big events that happened. Elon Musk with Twitter and letting that be a huge part of the conversation there, and the Trump presidency. How do you think those kind of events change the conversation around Christian nationalism? And, even with, is Christian nationalism dead, with President Trump and his actions and kind of his really robust plan to kind of break a lot of the old ways of thinking in government, things like Doge, thinks about the way he's even spoken about abortion, where everyone thought he was going to go one way, and now he seems to be pushing in a different direction. How do you think this vibe shift, as Santiago Pliego would say, like has really changed the importance and even the maybe urgency of like, hey, we need to get stuff figured out and not just be negatively critiquing one another, but we need to have a positive vision for what this will actually look like?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question too. And I think a big part of this goes back to 2020. Really, I was asking my father this question. 2020 happened. You remember the lockdowns and COVID, all that stuff. And there was just cataclysmic change societally. The economy was being shut down by our technocratic oligarchs. And, you were being, there were all sorts of medical mandates and mask mandates. And it just radically shifted life. And I asked my father, I said, at the time, I think he was 65. And I said, have you ever in your lifetime seen an event like this? Does it remind you of anything? Mm-hmm. And he said, just, without even having to think about it very long, he said, absolutely not. I've never seen anything this kind of like paradigm shattering in terms of what is our country, what is going on here. And so I think in many ways the mask went on, but the mask also proverbially came off. Yeah. And so a lot of people started asking questions. They're saying, wait a minute, all these things that we were told were conspiracy theories and we're not allowed to think about. And we had by that point, we had really at least 2 strong decades of really ramped up DEI and wokeness and CRT. You remember some of the pre-election time you had in Virginia, you had the school board meetings with the angry mothers who were like, you're teaching my kids what? And so I think what that did is even people who we might call, grill Americans, some people call them normies. I don't like that as much because it's sort of pejorative, but just the middle America I think people who just want to keep their heads down and do their work and take care of their families and live quietly, those people started waking up and seeing, wait, maybe some of these theories, that guys had been positing for a long time, including like Rushdoony in the 80s, about the total state, this God state, which just controlled everything in life. Maybe these guys were actually right. So that's part of the shift. And then I think because of the level of oppression, my read on the situation would be that the globalist elite, particularly the open society stuff, George Soros, but you also had guys like Rick Warren going to Davos in 2008. So the evangelical establishment is also involved in this. I think people start recognizing that. And the more that they see these things, the more that I think they become open to different and new ideas. You start to see that maybe this liberal order is collapsing. And even guys like Michael Lind and the New Class War, and then, with Rusty Reno and his book, Return of the Strong Gods, there were social political commentators who were starting to note, like, I think some things are changing. And maybe one of the strong gods that's coming back is the old traditional form of Christianity, the kind that shaped Christendom. And so I think with that, the window shifts hard right. And people are starting to kind of take these ideas more seriously, particularly with even with somebody like Dave Green, mentioning, I think in a recent Substack, he had said, it just looks like at the moment that the dissident right is ascendant and the left is just reeling. I mean, nothing that they're saying right now is winning. And so because of that shift, I think this is also what can cause actually some of the schismatic reactionary behavior for Christians. Is it's scary because it's like an earthquake and the fault lines are forming and the ground is shifting beneath your feet. And so maybe friends you had 6 months ago, maybe because of this or that issue, they're not your friends anymore. Maybe it was because of the vaccine. Maybe it was because of a theological position that you took. But I think because of all that cataclysmic social change, people have been willing to embrace new positions. Enter X with Elon Musk. And this becomes pivotal because you remember in COVID, I remember quoting the CDC somewhere during 2020.
Yeah.
I went to their website, I quoted something they said, I put it on Twitter, and I got the Jack Dorsey ban for like 2 weeks from the platform. And so that all changed, obviously, when Elon came in. Now, I think what is interesting, it's worth noting, Elon brought in a mixed bag, didn't he? I mean, there's huge changes, but you get, RFK coming in would be a good example to make America healthy again. I think overall, there's a lot of good things that would happen. Definitely want to improve our, food supply, water supply, take away, anything that's harmful that we're putting into our systems. That's great. But, not exactly the most moral, upstanding Christian person. I think with the H-1B crisis with Vivek that came on Christmas, I think the influx of guys who are from Silicon Valley, maybe badly misreading the tenor of America, the mood of America. So I think even that was like a schismatic event to some extent. You're open the floodgates to free speech through X, which is really important. But with that, you've got to understand it's also going to bring an agon and a clash of all these ideas. And then, the other thing you mentioned would be Trump. I don't think Trump gets elected without X changing hands in Elon Musk. Obviously, huge support from Elon. And then probably, I think, in my mind, the most pivotal event in July is the assassination attempt that fails. If you look back at world history and you look at leaders, assassination attempts often are read as mandates from heaven. God protected me. You've heard Trump say this, God protected me. I've been put here for a mission. It seems to have solidified that idea in him that he's here for a reason. I think all the executive orders that have flowed out of 2025 post-inauguration, which that was like day one, right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
All these executive orders, I'm not sure you would have got those from Trump. In fact, I don't believe you would have got those had Trump won in 2020.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
It was 4 years of lawfare against his family. It was 4 years of some of the most nationally contentious 4 years that I can remember. But again, now you have J.D. Vance in the White House. Mother Jones has covered this at length, but kind of seeing him as maybe one of the network nodes for this new right, however you want to define it. And the final thing I'll say about this, also attaching that with that ascendancy and with a new group that's ascendant to power, anytime you have a powerful group, it's natural that within that group, I think the real fight in America right now is how do we define the right? So you have guys who have been engaged in politics for a long time, anywhere from neoconservative to maybe a little more right of that. They're part of this new thing. The paleoconservative movement is resurgent. They're kind of part of this thing. And I think most of what you're seeing now is there's a fight over which principles and which right is actually going to maintain the power that has been transferred.
Yeah, it's interesting how much of that, specifically the last part you're talking about, is aesthetics. You know what I mean? Like how much of it's just like I just think about like the video edits. Like that was like a thing even before the dissident right, like video edits of like cheesy like girls who like Edward Cullen in Twilight. They would do like the video edits of him. It's like, but that stuff's coming big. Like, you know, there's like the Baron Trump memes. And it's so funny how like these aesthetics that I think a lot of the older class behind the people who would like be pro, like, hey, let's think about not whether, but which kind of, you know, Vantillian, the, you know, kind of people who carried on, I think the Bonson, Rushdoony legacy now as, you know, as they're older, I think they look at that and think of it as almost like, why are we even into this? But aesthetics are what drives like a lot of things. Memes are like, actually, I think ironically, a really big part of this whole thing. It carries a vibe, right? Because when you're talking about middle America, I once heard, I forgot who said it was someone on Twitter, but just this idea of generally the middle wants to just live their life, right? They don't want to be focused on this. And so it's going to be really the two far sides who are going to be pulling on it. And it's the job ultimately to not convince them that this side necessarily is better, but that's like the bad way. That's why Trump's, I think, presidency ad was so effective was, you know, she's for they, them, he's for you, right?
Yes.
And in that same way, like if you could show like, look at the danger. Hey, remember when we rejected Christianity? Look how bad that was. Don't do that again, right? And I think if we're able to do that, we're able to call people to like, here's where you need to go. And to me, a lot of this is the church. I'm not saying the church should be political, but I'm saying the church should be the spiritual center of America. And I think that's something every Christian, no matter if you're fully Anabaptist or not, right? We would all agree, like, Jesus Christ and his church is and should always be the spiritual center of any people for their good. And so when you're thinking about the church, you're a pastor, right? You minister, obviously you do podcasting, you have a lot of these conversations, you're active on X, but you're meeting with regular people. There's a community, there's people, you know, in Ogden, Utah, where you're ministering to. How do you think pastors and the church, maybe specifically like as an institution, as they think through Sunday, as they think through their, you know, their lives, how should they think about this moment? Is there something to capture in this moment? Is there some wave to like ride and be like, okay, let's use this now for maybe this is God's working? You know, how should we think about this as the church?
Yeah, such a good question. And I think pastorally, there's probably, we get this a lot. I think that, you know, I've done a lot of stuff on like masculinity. People think, oh, I'm going to come to your church on Sunday and this is going to be like the masculinity church, or this is going to be like the Christian Nationalism church. But realistically, what we're doing Sunday and with our people and the work of shepherding day in and day out is really going back to the old, classically reformed Westminsterian teachings. Strong households are the foundation of a strong nation. And those households are led by fathers who are under the authority of Christ and his headship, and they're under the authority of their elders. And so 98% of the stuff that we spend our time doing is counseling husbands how to lead their families well, doing family worship, ensuring that they have Christian discipleship, education, and catechesis for their children. We're teaching wives to love their husbands and care for their children. Because really, if you think about it, the framework would be, and this is kind of an old idea that the Puritans would have shared as well, but the idea really is that a nation is just an extension of the family and of the household. It's many households combined together for political ends. And so one of the things that we want to do is encourage people in the basic doctrines which have been abandoned for creating strong households Those households flow out into businesses. You think about Abraham and his household. The household wasn't just a hotel where you entertained yourselves. The household was productive. It was an economy unto itself. Husband and wife were engaged as the central pieces of that economy, which produces craziest thing that I can think of on planet Earth that God did. The husband and wife make people. I mean, just to wrap your mind around this, that God hardwired us so that a woman in all of her glory can make a human being. I mean, this is incredible. So encouraging people in doing that really vital work, doing it Christianly, and then from there is going to be the outflow into culture, into society. One other thing I would say pastorally is I think it's good in our era and in this moment to recognize that pastors have limits. And what I mean by that is ecclesiastical authority only goes so far. So, for example, I would say it's right and good that a pastor is calling the magistrates to legislate things that are righteous and according to God's law and God's standard. That's all good and well. But I think particularly, like, let's say you have a group of men in your church and they're like, hey, we want to read Stephen Wolfe on Christian nationalism, or we want to read maybe a more theonomic view on this. We want to discuss these things. Pastorally, we can participate, we can weigh in, but at some level, we've got to say, you know, whether you end up more Van Tillian or more Calvin on this issue, it's beyond our jurisdiction to say that you're outside the bounds of orthodoxy or something like that. And so I think for us, because so many of these political conversations are going on, we just want to be careful how we treat them. When guys come to us and they say, well, I've been reading this. We've had some guys recently talking about monarchy. And I'm like, okay. I mean, I think as a political end right now, that's just not going to happen, as I said before. But there's nothing that prohibits them from reading that material, thinking through it. Obviously, you can read the Old Testament, and we have kings and such. And so you can read, you know, Samuel Rutherford and Lex Rex. You can kind of get an understanding of how the Old Testament monarchies worked. I think that's all good and well. And then I think, too, throughout this process, we've really been trying to build coalitions with other pastors, even across differences, so that as we work on doctrinal clarity and doctrinal unity, that would be the end goal, that we, you know, there will be great peace in the church when we all simply just agree. That would be ideal. But we realize that's going to be a long process. And so really wanting to encourage our people to be charitable, to work through these things in a way that isn't a distraction, because it really is true inevitably for any man in particular, especially young men. It's easy to pick up a book and to become kind of focused on one thing, which is fine and good. It's not an idol. You can read political theology. That's all good. You just want to keep it in proportion. So if there's major issues with discipleship in the home with your children, for example, let's deal with those things pastorally. And so encouraging pastors to, keep that in mind, keep doing the good work of going through your confessions. If you're 1689 or Westminster, that's fine. We have both. But just encouraging guys to be good fathers in that way. And then developing along the way it's going to be long conversations of political theology. Yeah. Much like a lot of pastors, I think, could identify with this. When I was in the SBC, there's a lot of guys working through Arminianism and Calvinism. And a wise pastor will look at that and he'll say, okay, if our church is going to make a change or go into these topics, it's not going to be 5 minutes. Yeah. You know, I can't just present Calvinism and then tomorrow everybody's like, you're right. I repent of it all. I'm just going to change my position. So having that sort of long suffering as pastors to continue to work through issues.
Well, that concept right there has like changed, I think, how I think through my marriage, how I think through, I have one little daughter, and I think through my parenting as a father. I think about my work, my church life. Obviously, I'm part of Eschatology Matters. I like these conversations. I like getting into them. But even at church, like, I'm not going to agree with everything in my church. If I become so fixated on these topics, I am a miserable congregant, right? Hebrews 13 makes it clear. I should obey my leaders, and I should make their task a joyful one. And the reason is not because, hey, you should want them to have such a happy life. It says because to not do that is no advantage to you, right? And I think this is the difficulty of, yes, we want to push back against evil. Yes, we want to push for goodness, But when you're working together with other people, I think it was Nate Fisher who said this. I forgot who mentioned this, but there's a difference you could tell between people whose main task is to talk through ideas and people's main task is to build things. Because people who talk about things, like that's their main focus, there's a temptation for them to be okay with disagreement and actually emphasize disagreement because that's where they tease out that. But people who build things, they have to be more okay with disagreement. They have to be more kind of a unified focus, a more ecumenical approach, a more, kind and gentle approach, less polemics, right? Because to build something intrinsically, you need other people, right? We're talking, you could just talk all day by yourself on a podcast, right? And that idea of building something, especially in a family, like God's wise, he made man and woman. Those are distinct sexes for a reason, because they won't have all commonality. And it's good that the mother is more tenderly and even empathetic, right? You have to do with me and all of that, right? But like even genuinely empathetic, like where a man may be like, I'm going to tether it a little more, but that tension between my wife, when my little daughter falls, like running to like coddle her, right? Versus me saying like, hey, like she kind of needs to learn that. And that tension is good and healthy. It's the same in the church. It's only though when one person says, this idea is necessary. This idea is, I need, like, whether it's monarchy or something like that, right? We need to be people who are able to unify for a common goal. So I really appreciate that word, Eric. Kind of want to give you a little bit, kind of our last kind of talking point for this episode is, what advice do you have for Christian men in this time? So obviously, we talked about the household, we talked about in church, but even like broadly, is it the time to start a business? Is it time to like, hey, if you have any dry powder, let's invest it? Like, how should we be thinking? To me, as a young guy who's kind of growing up in his career, I'm trying to make a big shift right now in my career. I'm trying to talk to my buddies like, hey, can we pull some things to do something? Because I think there's a very unique opportunity right now. And guys like Elon Musk, guys like Vivek, whatever we think about them, the reason why they are those names is because they built up wealth and they built up things so that now their influence is more meaningful than a guy like me who hasn't built that. And I think Christians need to start thinking that way of like, hey, I don't want all these rich like atheists or Hindus, right, to be the one who have the money and the resource power. I would love Christian men to have that sort of resource. So kind of any advice maybe about building businesses? What's a positive vision for Christian men to pursue kind of in these next couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. We spent a lot of time thinking about this because just much like you said, you're watching the events that are happening and, like men of Issachar, we want to know the times. You remember Christ, he'll actually chastise the people for, do you know how to read the weather? Yeah. How do you not know how to read what's going on in your own context? And so I think a big part of it for us, this will be a major theme at our conference in June, will be recovering the spirit of American greatness, and particularly with the Christian founding, and thinking about the bravery and the risk-taking endeavors that were made by our forefathers to carve out a place where their offspring could live and thrive and build an American, at least, version of Christendom. And I think what it really takes, I think back to a conversation I had with Michael Foster in 2020, and that was unlike this period. That was a time of doom and gloom and blackbilling. And Michael reminded me of something really important. He said, there were people in the Great Depression who built everything that they had, and what you remember them for, they built it in that time period. And so there's always opportunity set out before you, but especially now, you've watched Mark Andreessen and you've watched Elon. What Elon said the night of the election, I think I knew it was going to be a pivotal point of the message from them, which is it's time to build. This is an exciting time. They had even asked Elon, they said, people have tried to kill you. And Elon was like, yeah, that's unfortunate. But let me tell this to the American people. This is a time to build. And so when you look at it, you're like, okay, well, they're taking real steps to get rid of the IRS. They're trying to bring manufacturing back to America, which is a short-term rise in the cost of goods, likely, but a long-term benefit to the American worker when manufacturing returns here. So you look at that, they're closing the border. They're making our cities safer by removing violent criminals. That's all really good stuff. I think there's going to be through DOGE, the government restriction that prohibits businesses from doing business and making it difficult to start a business. A lot of that stuff is going to greatly diminish. And so when you look at that and you say the environment is ripe But what will it take for a man to capitalize on those things? One of the things that has struck me is I've been reading about Portugal. And you say, why Portugal? Well,
Yeah.
Portugal was a country of about 2 million people. And they, in about, it's like the late 1400s, became the first global empire, the Portuguese. 2 million people on the edge of a continent. How did they do it? Well, because Henry the Navigator and then the kings following him said, we don't care what it takes. We're going to circumvent Islam and the Islamic grasp on trade. So it's largely economic. And they're going to do something that is unfathomable in an age where they didn't even have the maps. They said, we're going to sail around Africa and we're going to go to China and India. We're going to do that thing. And they would send 300 ships and like 250 of them would not return. And they would say, we're going to do it again.
Wow.
And they would just keep marching down the coast and they would build these Christian pillars, proclaiming the name of Christ, and they would plant them on the coast of Africa and they would keep going. And what did that take? It took men who were not like the men in our age predominantly. It wasn't about safety first, because if safety is first, you'll never do anything. So I think it's about encouraging guys to have that kind of spirit, to lead well, not be controlled by the most noisy, dissident voices who always criticize and schoolmarm you, but to encourage those men to take bold risks. We're going to have a lot of information, I think, too, that we are coming out with about starting businesses. We want to encourage people. If you want to, you look at what Elon has already done. There's been the fork in the road for government employees. They gave them 8 months pay, a lot of them, the option to take 8 months pay and quit or return to the office. And so I asked a few guys, I said, what's going on here? And they said, Elon and Trump, they want to downsize the government. Well, you can read that as a bad thing, or you can say, this is an opportunity to go invest in other places entrepreneurially. Seeing economy and business as an extension of your household is so critical that they should be Christian businesses because you have a Christian household and you should run them Christianly and you should disciple your people Christianly. And then if we build these things out over time, you're going to have this crazy thing called a Christian society. And so encouraging men with that. I think also this would be the time to be a student and to be voracious and to be reading and thinking through a lot of these difficult issues. Look at your own giftings and say, what are you good at? What could you contribute that the world doesn't currently have? And then being able to go out and provide value. I would say with Elon too, he had a really pivotal point a couple of years ago. He said, everybody's obsessed with crypto and that's great for wealth preservation. But he said the real ticket here is wealth creation. And that's not what crypto is. We need people who run businesses and quite simply make things that other people need or provide services that other people need. And if you can do that, well, if you run a successful business, it's going to generate a lot more income than even, stable rates of increase in whatever, portfolio you have in crypto or something like that. So I think just encouraging guys to be productive in those ways, be risk takers. I think pastorally, just to speak to that for a moment, I think we're just going to have to keep being courageous. Some of us, I would say, have been a little bit like the tip of the spear, but the goal is to encourage other pastors. You've got to stand up to feminism. You've got to stand up to egalitarianism. You have got to stand up to some of the destructive things happening in culture. Yes, they will hate you. Yes, it won't be winsome, but you've got to plant your flag and you've got to be willing to sacrifice for something. Remembering the words of Jesus that he said, if you follow me, you will be hated. And then you can rejoice when you're persecuted because you're following after the Lord. So just encouraging guys in all of that bold risk-taking endeavor.
Yeah. And that sort of, I think, positive vision is where all of this like aesthetics towards, I think, the new dissident right is having so much of its strong powers, like thinking about the old times, right? When there was some greatness, one of the images I love is like the cowboy. I think it's such a iconic American image of this is a person who would ride into towns, who would ride into, Indian territory, who would go into dangerous areas, right? No one would think of him as like, oh, he's a safe person, right? He's a bold person, right? He's a daring person, right? And that is kind of really the American kind of impulse. And I love I'm sure you've probably read like the that hideous strength, right? And one thing I love about
Yes.
it, talks about like the uniquely Christian version of all these different nations. Like Britain's Christianity is going to look like this, China's one, France, and I think the American Christianity is going to look like people who love liberty. That's if there's one thing about America, it's love that. I remember COVID, the fireworks when they said don't do fireworks, and I remember in Orange County, California,
Oh
like
yeah.
just fireworks everywhere for like 6 straight hours, and I'm just like, okay, so we really don't like being told no, right? Though ironically, we failed that pretty miserably also with the masks, but we also love daring and entrepreneurship, and that to me is like that old, some people call it like the Puritan work ethic, that idea of
Yes.
like work is good. Greg Bonson's son, Dave Bonson, is a wealth manager. I know there's a lot of different views on him, but he has this book called Full Time Work that really helped me see this. I'm in investments as well. It helped me to really see like work is not something I do to get a vacation, to get a retirement. Work is the very thing God has called me to. Right.
Yes.
The thing that God called Adam to was not to enjoy his wife, to enjoy his kids, and to enjoy the garden. His job was to tend the garden, really learn from the garden how God gave him this, and then to spread that over the whole world, to go into desolate lands that haven't yet, no shrub have come up in the field, right? To really bring that the paradise, right, of Eden, that garden to the whole world. And now as Christians, we get that with the gospel, right? There's desolate places spiritually, but we even see that, I think, in business with government being pulled back again, depending on how big they go. Department of Education, that'd be very interesting. IRS, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Regulations, that's very interesting. Humanitarian aid, right? There may be like legitimate needs that pop up. Some of those things are just fluff and it's just waste. But because of that, they may say, hey, government's no longer going to be in charge of education, at least as significantly. Then that means all these people need to build schools. They need to think through education. And I think when you get people excited about that, you put it back into their hands. It is scary, but it's a good fear, right? It's kind of like this, nervousness before a big football game, and you would want to be nervous because you're realizing the weightiness of everything that's happening right now. But there's an excitement that says, I'm the man for the hour. Not because I'm special, right? No sufficiency in myself, but because God has placed me in this hour, right? We don't choose, as what is it Gandalf says, right? We don't choose a time and hour, right? That we're set in, but we need to do what we're called to when the time has the time has come. And so, yeah, man, Eric, I love that vision. It sounds like you guys are doing something at Ogden. I want to make sure that people know kind of all the stuff you guys are doing, maybe point them in different directions where they can find and support your work. It sounds like you have a conference coming up. Love you to plug all of that for the people.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have newchristianpress.com. You can find the majority of the works that we're associated with. We've got podcasts from Haunted Cosmos to King's Hall. You can find all of that there. And then, more information on the conference June 12th through 14th in Ogden, Utah. And Safety Third, recovering the spirit of American greatness.
Nice.
Encourage everybody to be there. And I will make a plug for that conference as well. One of the main things that we're trying to do is investment guys, guys who are interested in Christian businesses and infrastructure. We will have a VIP and a business mixer there. A lot of high net worth guys will be networking at that event. So if you're a builder, if you're a CEO or somebody who can run a business, or if you're tied to the funding side, would love to speak with you. We realize it's going to take a lot of those efforts to build Christendom. Christendom was all of society. It wasn't just the church. So we're trying to get those guys together, and we'd love to see more of that happen. And singles mixer, we need to see marriages and
Yes,
people
sir.
brought together, family started. We had a few marriages.
Yeah, I was going to
this
say,
year.
I saw on Twitter like some marriages come out from it.
Oh yeah, it was fantastic. I love getting the wedding invites. And we're like, praise God, like more Christian families starting, like-minded people. So yeah, builders of all types. We want to see there. The other thing you can do is you can go on X and you can find myself, Eric, it's ERAC_Conn, CONN, or Brian Sauvé. We're kind of the prominent guys there on X to follow kind of along with everything that we got going on.
Yeah, and if you guys are Westminster people, Brian's Westminster songs, I use them regularly. My daughter, when I start singing, even the first question, she smiles and claps now, and so it's just a lot of fun. But yeah, Eric, really appreciate the work you're doing. I know it's a fight there, and we want to make sure we're throwing punches. But as you said, there's a part that we need to be united. So it's all this fun, all this fighting, but all for the glory of God and for Christ's kingdom. And so really appreciate you joining us. Hopefully we'll have you on maybe some other time. But yeah, thanks for joining the show, Eric.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate it, brother.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake.